Sunjiro, aka A9C388, aka Kadala here, and today I wanted to give you a little bit of an instruction on how I've been creating some generative music using Sonic Pi. So for me, I love using Sonic Pi, and I use it in my production techniques all the time. But something that's really fascinating to me about it is the ability for us to use it to create generative music. Even though I've been using Sonic Pi for quite a long time, when I started getting more into exploring generative music, I initially went more in the direction of thinking about how to do it all from inside of the DAW that I use, Ableton. But I found that a lot of the tutorials that I was finding were insufficient, particularly because I'm using Ableton Live Lite rather than like a normal Ableton. And so for me, that kind of prompted me to now go back into my bag and explore how to use Sonic Pi, which I'm already using for my music production, to get into this world of some generative music stuff. And so, yeah, this is kind of just an exploration of how I've been going about doing that with Sonic Pi, also using my DAW. And so, yeah, let's jump on in. Right now, in the background, what you're hearing is music that I've generated using Sonic Pi, Ableton, and the free Surge synth, which is an open source synthesizer. It has a ton of presets in there. It also is like super customizable, and I definitely recommend it. So let's start to jump in. Also, these visuals that we're seeing here are using Hydra. So in combination with the the generative music. I've also been generating visuals using Hydra. My next step is now figuring out how to control the two together or have one alter the other, but that's going to be a tutorial for another day. So let's hop on in. And let me first start by just stopping the audio here so that we can kind of just start from scratch. Or not quite scratch, but just work from a place of making it a little bit easier to hear what I'm thinking about. So this particular track is called Octopolis, as we can see here at the top, and it's named after a poem that I wrote a few years back, and I was just kind of trying to create that vibe. That's kind of how I start with my productions a lot of the time, thinking about a specific kind of sound or audio that, like audio aesthetic that I want to go for, and then building out from there. And so, because of that, before I even hop into Sonic Pi, a lot of the time, what I do is I come in and I start by identifying what are the sounds that I want to hear. And so for this particular project, I was really interested in the idea of eventually creating some sort of application that is a generative audio app. And so for this, what I did was I wanted to make sure that I was using Surge for all of the different instruments because if I am able to eventually create this application, I want to be able to use some sort of open source synthesizer so that it can be packaged directly inside of the application itself instead of having to connect externally to another VST or another synth. And so I come in here and, you know, my workflow is when I download a new synth like this one, I'll go through and just like listen to all of the different patches that exist in there. There's so many in here. And then I go through and, you see I heart them so that I know, okay, this sounds pretty good for different styles or different techniques that I'm going for. So after I played around in here and explored what kind of sounds I think will work together, this track is kind of watery. I'll go in and just like isolate and figure out what exactly the different instruments will be. I then come in and I change their channels. So then that way in Sonic Pi, I'm able to control them with MIDI. So I'll obviously when I set up the Sonic Pi, I'll test them out one by one just to make sure that it's going to the right thing. But ultimately, this is what it usually ends up looking like for me. I'll have a few different instruments, each one set to their own channel, and then I have I actually have two different virtual MIDI buses on my computer active for different purposes, but I'll just keep it to the all ins without worrying too much about which MIDI bus it's coming through. Then over here, this is where things are going to get interesting using Sonic Pi. So this isn't actually the code itself that I'm going to be using, but I kind of did this in two phases, right? First, what I did was after figuring out what the different sounds were that I wanted, I then created a Sonic Pi sketch that is similar to what my typical Sonic Pi creations look like if I'm going to be playing something live, for example. And so what I mean by that is you'll notice there's all of these different live loops. Whenever I start a new uh, Sonic Pi track, I tend to have these few lines up here at the top in every single one. First, I want to set the BPM, and then I create like a tick that everything is synced to. And you can notice all of these live loops have their own like sync to that. And then from there, I got into the creation of the tracks themselves. And so what I mean by that is here, these are all sections that can be played live without worrying too much about continuing onward forever, right? So this is just like we can hear now in the background, there's one instrument, then here we have a second instrument coming in. And if you were to go and uncomment all of these different sections, they would all be playing all at once in a way that might actually get kind of overwhelming, right? It's like a lot of sound coming at you all at once. Yeah, so like I was saying, but I'm getting cut off by the audio from here, is that when these are all playing all at once, it can be a lot of sound and it can be kind of overwhelming. And so what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that in this particular sketch, this is kind of the sketch that I use to figure out how exactly everything is going to play together, kind of thinking about what is like the peak sound going to be for all of them, and just like outlining what are the different um, patterns going to be for each of the different instruments, right? Then once I feel like comfortable with what this sounds like, I come into a new sketch and I start to get a little bit more in depth into the actual like um, programmatic music side of things or generative music side of things. But just to kind of explore a little bit here to go through some of the more advanced techniques that I'm talking about on this side, um, let's break down the five different instruments that I have. First, you'll notice that I have a variable. Well, okay, even before that, let's get into something even more fundamental. It's possible for you to sync different live loops with each other in a way that makes it so that if I'm going to start uh, the sketch over, and let's say I have this stop function here, and I unstop it and I hit play, what might happen if I don't have this in sync is it might just, or it will just start playing as soon as I tell it to start, right? But once I include this sync function, it's basically saying, don't start playing this until this starts up again. And so that makes it so that the sounds can be a little bit more rhythmic. You don't have things hitting or starting randomly in a way that sounds a little asymmetrical. Then the next line that we have here is stop, and this is a really good technique for, especially if you're doing live stuff. You can just comment this in or comment it out. And so when it's not commented out, it just means that it'll stop playing after the loop is finished. But if it is commented, then that means it will go through. It'll allow you to keep playing it. And then what we have here is use MIDI defaults. And so this is really helpful, um, particularly in my case, because I like to use Sonic Pi to control another DAW. And so this is basically just saying that every time you run this, every time there is a MIDI note that's going out, make sure it goes out on channel one. And so that's something that exists on all of my instruments, but it's set to the specific channel. Then we have this variable here, sus. And so sus, to me, I'm using to mean sustain. And so the reason that I'm using this variable instead of just setting the sustain is to make sure that the sustain is equal to the length of the the note itself, or the amount of time that the loop goes through and before it sleeps, or how long it should sleep for when it goes out. So this is basically saying, the sustain will be, let's say, 4 beats, and then the sleep will be equal to it. So that way it never gets out of sync, even if I'm generating a new length every time, right? Um, and then here in knit, what this is saying is basically it's still randomly choosing from a few values, but it allows you to kind of weight the different values so that you can have some things be more likely to occur and other things less likely to occur. So for example, really here you see 4, 2, 8, 1, 16, 1. What this is saying is that 4, 8, and 16 are potential values that sus can be. 2 is saying that it should have a weight of 2, meaning that 2 is going to be more likely to happen than 1. So 4 is twice as likely to hit than 8 and 16 are. So that means that it's more likely that my sustain and my sleep will be a length of 4 than it is to be a length of 8 or 16. Meaning, from this code, basically, in plain English, my note is twice as likely to be 4 beats long as it is to be 8 or 16 beats, right? Then coming down here into this MIDI note, I am randomly choosing a note from within 1 octave that is in the scale of E3 Rust. And each time it plays, it will play a different random note from within this scale, but it'll always be confined to the scale, which allows it to stay within some level of musicality. And then it has sustain. And so this is really helpful for MIDI notes. Instead of me having to go in and say MIDI note on, MIDI note off, which can get really messy, it's allowing me to just say, this is what the sustain is going to be. And that might also be why there might be some confusion about this sus variable, is because normally if I'm having a MIDI note on and a MIDI note off, I'll only have one variable, right? I could have just said, note length here as my variable and then put it in uh for the sleep in between the MIDI note on and MIDI note off. But because I'm using the sustain function here, I need to be able to change it. Also, the reason I'm using that is because there are going to be times where I want to have my sustain, and my sleep be slightly different so that I can get some interesting effects. Like, for example, if I were to set my sleep here to sus divided by 2, then that means that my note will be halfway through playing before it triggers the next note, which means I'll then end up having two notes playing all at once and kind of layer in a way that adds some interesting complexity. And so that's something that I do in other parts of the code, and that's why I use this one variable, right? But now, so that's kind of like, let's say, medium or intermediate level difficulty. Getting into the harder stuff, this is where we get into this nice nitty gritty of generative music. So you'll notice immediately that whereas in this side, I'm using live loops to control things, instead here, this code is essentially the same, except I'm defining functions instead of using live loops for the instruments, right? And a part of that definition is me introducing these variables that can be changed within the code when you actually call the function. So for all of the instruments that I had before, I've essentially copied them over and changed them from live loops into definitions. And then I've also added in a few of these variables. And with these variables, you're able to then change specific pieces inside of this code. So it's essentially saying if I call this function Canadians and I feed it in two of these variables, length and velocity, it will push the length into the value here and the velocity into the value here. So for example, maybe I have something down the line, and let me just make sure to put this in comments so I don't mess things up later. I could say live loop do, and then I always say the end there, and then I'd call, there you go, I'd call Canadians. Actually, let me just not comment this out for now. It's getting a little, oops. I'd say Canadians, and then I could say length 1, velocity 3. And then now that means that the length will multiply by 4 here, by 8 here, by 16 here, and the velocity will change as well to 3. And then if I were to call, I could again call this thing immediately after it. Uh, Let me say a sleep of 1. And then if instead here I say 2 and 50, then the length here is now going to be 8, 16, and 32, right? And so that's really helpful for doing programmatic or generative stuff, um, because it allows you to do something interesting that I will show you down here. So after I've defined all of my instruments, what I do is I create a live loop called phrase control, right? And my thinking behind this, or the logic behind this section, is basically when I'm creating generative music, I don't want for the music to play the same level of randomization consistently throughout the track, right? I want it to play out in different phrases, sort of like a traditional track where you have like a hook and a bridge and a chorus, but I want to, one, have what phrase is being selected be random, and then two, I want for different things to manifest inside of the different instruments depending on what the phrase is, to make sure that there's still some energy and make sure that there's still some movement and it's not just like the same thing over and over and over again, right? And so what I do is I create this thing called like a phrase control live loop. um, and then the first thing that I do at the top of this live loop is I set uh, I set something that basically randomly chooses what the phrase is, right? And here you can see I'm using the same technique as on the other side, where I'm using knit in order to say, I want for the first phrase to be the most common, then I want for the second phrase to be, medium level of commonness, and then the third phrase to be, pretty rare, right? And so the reason why it's like that in this particular track is because the third phrase has a lot of high energy, and I want that to only come in relatively randomly, relatively sparsely, so that it kind of like picks up the energy at some points, but it's not overwhelming. And that this is like for a generative track that's pretty ambient, and you can play in the background of something. Um, then what I have here is a bunch of if then statements that say if I am playing phrase 1. I want it to play 12 times before it randomly selects what phrase it's going to play again next. Then for phrase 2, play 8 times. For phrase 3, 3 times, and so on and so forth, right? And so with these two things in combination with each other, it guarantees that we're going to hear phrase 1 a lot more than we're going to hear phrase 3, right? Then after I've done this kind of like up here, I guess you could call these things like phrase selection. After phrase selection, we get into the actual like playing of the different instruments. And so for each one of these instruments, what we have is a live loop for the specific instrument. So the other one, the instrument is called Canadians, as you can see here. And then the live loop is called Canadian's phrase or Canadian phrase. And what it does is within it, it has again a bunch of if then statements. And within the if then statements, it's saying for every type of phrase that there is, one, two, three, I want to play this instrument and I'm feeding it specific variables like what I had mentioned up top, right? So here, where length is, the length is going to be whatever phrase is being played. So here, it's phrase one, so the length will be one, and then now that length variable will multiply by the length 4, 8, and 16 inside of the Canadian function that is defined up top. And the velocity will be 100 for phrase one. For phrase two, the length will equal 2 and the velocity will equal 50. And so these are going to be much longer notes, and the strength of it or the velocity will be half as hard. And then for phrase three, the length will be 3 and the velocity will be 10. And so what you can see here is with this instrument is going to be the dominant instrument during phrase one. But as you get into phrase two and get into phrase three, it kind of tones down, becomes much more stretched out and more ambient, uh, which then allows for these other instruments to really come in and shine um, as the track goes on. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't want to go too deeply into the track here, but essentially, this is just, uh, yeah, this is like an overview of how I structure tracks that are being generated, right? And so let me unstop all of these so that we can start to hear the track itself. And I can hopefully talk through some of the things that I've talked about here, but as they're playing in real time. And so, with the way that I have this created, when phrase one is going, you'll have this first Canadian instrument and the VHS instrument kind of the most dominant. And so that's kind of the like background key or the background note that you hear, as well as that kind of like instrument that you hear. That right there, when I played this track for a friend, and they kind of described it as like something very big dying or giving birth in the background. That's this VHS sound. But I also altered it a little bit. Whereas in the other phrases, you start to get the bass smoothie, and you get the slow poly and the verb sounds to come in. And so those are the ones that are much more like frenetic and a lot faster paced. Yeah. Just let this play out for a little bit. Yeah, I mean, so I have really been enjoying creating more like generative work. I've really been enjoying playing more, making more music with Sonic Pi and more visuals with Hydra. And so hopefully over the course of the next however long, I'll get into the practice of making more of these videos to kind of walk people through how I'm making the things that working on. If you have specific questions, if you want to see me give like a more in-depth tutorial of this specific track, let me know. I'm also gonna post the information about how I structured this track in thread in Sonic Pi, so I'll put that link in the description. Yeah. Thank you for taking the time to watch and to listen. Let me know in the comments if there's anything in particular you want to see. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks.